Aureliano Karsk had signed prosperity into existence that morning. 12 documents promising abundance in a kingdom where garbage grew like crops. He shouldn't have driven past the palace gates. Shouldn't have seen the girl's body curved around a coughing child on discarded things that still carried, well, broken dreams maybe. Or just wait. Her eyes opened without fear. Only calculation. Another powerful stranger who might help or harm. Probably both. The boy in her arms wheezed through lips tinged blue with cold. Too small for the violence of this forgotten place that existed beneath his signed reports. 8 years of governing. 8 years of trusting numbers that never smelled like rot. Never sounded like difficult breathing. The girl watched him with the wariness of someone who'd learned that rescue always came with a price she couldn't afford to pay. Aureliano felt something crack where certainty used to live. Not his heart. That would break later, when he understood how thoroughly his distance had failed the people it was supposed to protect. This was smaller, sharper, the sound of assumptions splitting along fault lines he'd never known existed. The rain began to fall on gardens that would continue blooming, on garbage that would continue growing, on palace walls and broken children, washing nothing clean. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The morning report sat unopened on Aureliano's desk. Coffee had formed a skin on top while he stared at the window, counting the number of times the gardener bent to pull the same weed. 7 times. The gardener's back made a clicking sound each time he straightened. "Your Majesty." The secretary's voice came through the intercom with that particular thinness. Bad news wrapped in protocol. "The Eastern District inspection has been postponed." Aureliano pressed the button without looking. "Reason? Flooding. The drainage system needs—" He released the button. The secretary's voice cut off mid-word. The gardener was now examining something in his palm. Probably an insect. Maybe nothing. People looked at nothing when they didn't want to think. The Eastern District had been postponed 3 times. Each report cited different problems. Flooding, roadwork, security concerns. Aureliano had signed the delays without reading past the first line. Delegation was supposed to eliminate the need for his physical presence. Kings weren't meant to wade through drainage problems. His phone buzzed. A message from the Minister of Welfare. All housing initiatives on track. Statistics attached. The attachment icon showed a small number, 847 KB. Aureliano didn't open it. Numbers were clean. Numbers didn't smell or make sounds or ask for things he couldn't immediately provide. The gardener had moved to a different section. The abandoned weed stood crooked where he'd left it. Aureliano walked to the coffee machine and poured a fresh cup. The old one sat cooling, unwanted and complete. He should have thrown it away, but couldn't remember the last time he'd thrown anything away himself. Someone else handled disposal. Someone else handled most things. The map on his wall showed the kingdom in precise colors. Green for residential areas, blue for commercial districts, yellow for agricultural zones. No color for places that didn't fit categories. The Eastern District appeared as a small gray patch, marked "Under Review" in his own handwriting from 2 years ago. "Under Review" had become permanent. He walked to the window again. The gardener was gone. The crooked weed remained. Aureliano put on his coat without calling for a driver. His keys were in the drawer where he'd left them years ago, under a stack of unread letters from citizens. The letters were addressed in cramped handwriting, the kind that suggested urgency or desperation. Both. He left the letters where they were. The drive took 40 minutes through districts he recognized from aerial photographs. Roads grew narrower, buildings lower and darker. Paint peeled from walls in strips that caught the wind and made scratching sounds against brick. Children played in yards filled with car parts and plastic containers. They stopped playing to watch his car pass. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be watched by people who didn't expect anything from him. The Eastern District began without warning. One moment the road was paved. The next it turned to packed dirt with holes that made the car bounce. The steering wheel vibrated in his hands. He'd forgotten that cars could feel unstable, that roads could fight back. Buildings here looked temporary, as if they'd been assembled from materials never intended to last. Walls were made of metal sheets, wood scraps, whatever had been available. Windows were covered with plastic that flapped when the wind caught it. The sound reminded him of the flags at the palace, but higher pitched, desperate. He parked next to a fence made of chicken wire and rusty poles. Through the fence, he could see piles of refuse. Broken furniture, bags split open and spilling their contents, appliances with their guts exposed. The smell reached him even with the windows closed. Sweet rot mixed with metal and something chemical he couldn't identify. A dog picked through the garbage, pausing to look at him before returning to its search. The dog's ribs showed through matted fur. It limped on its front left leg but kept digging. Aureliano opened the car door. The smell became stronger, more complex. Underneath the obvious decay was something else. The scent of people living too close together, of washing that never fully dried, of food cooked with whatever was available. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was dense with information he didn't know how to process. He walked along the fence, following a path worn by many feet. The garbage extended further than he'd expected. Hills and valleys like a landscape built from discarded things. Someone had tried to organize it. Metal in one area, cloth in another, food waste in a third. But the organization was overwhelmed by volume. Good intentions buried under the sheer weight of what needed disposing. That's when he saw her. The girl was curled in the shadow of an overturned washing machine. Her body wrapped around something small that moved with the rhythm of breathing. Her hair was dark and tangled, woven through with bits of debris, small twigs, a piece of plastic wrapper, something that might have been string. Her clothes were layers, a shirt over another shirt over what looked like a child's sweater, all of them torn and stained, but carefully arranged to provide maximum coverage. The thing she protected was a child, maybe 3 years old. Hard to tell through the dirt and the way he was positioned, face pressed against the girl's chest. His breathing was audible even from a distance. A slight wheeze that suggested congestion, or worse. Aureliano stopped walking. He'd seen poverty in photographs, had reviewed reports with footnotes about malnutrition and inadequate shelter, but the reports had been typed on clean paper, presented in folders that smelled like fresh ink. They'd never included the sound of difficult breathing, or the sight of someone sleeping on garbage because garbage was softer than concrete. The girl's eyes opened. She didn't startle, didn't cry out, just opened her eyes and looked at him with complete alertness, as if she'd been pretending to sleep. Her gaze went to his clothes, his shoes, his clean hands. Her arms tightened around the child. "You lost?" Her voice was rough. Thirst, or cold, or both. Aureliano realized he didn't know how to answer. He was exactly where he'd intended to be. That didn't mean he wasn't lost. I was inspecting the district. She made a sound that might have been laughter. "Inspect away." She gestured at the garbage surrounding them. "Plenty to see." The child stirred, opened eyes that were the same dark brown as the girl's. He looked at Aureliano without fear or interest, as if adults were a category of thing that sometimes appeared and sometimes didn't. No predictable pattern. The child's lips were chapped and slightly blue at the edges. "He needs water," Aureliano said. It was the only thing he could think to say. The girl's expression sharpened. "He gets water. I get him water." "Where?" She pointed to a building visible through the fence. "Public tap. Sometimes it works. Sometimes." Aureliano had signed water infrastructure budgets for 3 consecutive years. The reports had listed full coverage and optimal flow rates. Optimal, apparently, meant sometimes. The child began to cough. Small dry sounds that seemed to echo in his narrow chest. The girl shifted position, trying to shield him from the wind. Her movements were careful, practiced. She'd done this many times before. "There's a medical center," Aureliano said, "in the central district. They could—" "No papers." The girl cut him off. "No address, no parents with jobs. They don't treat questions." Questions. That's what she was, what they both were. People who didn't fit into the neat categories that made governance possible. No place in the green or blue or yellow sections of his map. Gray areas that existed between official districts, sustained by discarded things and broken infrastructure. The child coughed again. The sound was getting worse, wetter. The girl's hand moved to his forehead, checking temperature with the back of her knuckles. Her touch was gentle but clinical, the gesture of someone who'd learned to be her own medical system. "What's your name?" Aureliano asked. The girl studied his face. "Mirella." She paused. "This is Caden." Caden. The boy had a name, an identity beyond his cough and his circumstances. Aureliano felt something crack inside his understanding of administrative efficiency. Names were harder to delegate than statistics. "I'm Aureliano." Mirella's eyes widened slightly. She'd recognized him, or at least the significance of his name. But she didn't bow or apologize or ask for help. She just held Caden closer and watched Aureliano with the wariness of someone who'd learned that powerful people were dangerous, even when they seemed kind. Especially when they seemed kind. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Caden shivered in his thin clothes. Mirella pulled the child's sweater higher, trying to cover his exposed neck. The sweater was too small. Probably salvaged from the garbage around them. It had cartoon characters on it that Aureliano didn't recognize, faded from repeated washing or weather. "Come with me," he said. The words came out before he decided to say them. Mirella's body tensed. Why? Why? Because Caden needed medical attention and warm clothes and food that wasn't scavenged. Because Mirella deserved better than sleeping on garbage while he lived in a palace with 47 rooms and 3 kitchens. Because every budget he'd approved and every report he'd signed had somehow failed to prevent this. But saying any of that would sound like justification. As if he were trying to convince her that his guilt was a good reason to trust him. She was right to be suspicious. Powerful people always wanted something, even when they pretended to give. "Because it's going to rain," he said instead. Mirella looked at the sky, then at Caden, then at the garbage that surrounded them. Her calculation was visible. Staying meant definite discomfort. Leaving meant unknown risk. She'd survived this long by minimizing risk, by keeping her options limited but predictable. Caden coughed again. The sound decided for her. "If this is a trick," she said, gathering their few possessions into a plastic bag, "I'll remember." Aureliano helped her stand. She moved stiffly, as if her body had been held in one position too long. Caden wrapped his arms around her neck and buried his face against her shoulder. He was heavier than his size suggested. Maybe Mirella was weaker than she looked. They walked to the car together, an odd procession through the garbage landscape. The dog watched them go, then returned to its search. It had found something interesting, a bone with meat still attached, probably thrown away by someone who had enough food to waste parts of it. Mirella stopped at the passenger door. "Where are we going?" The question was practical, not curious. She needed to know what she was agreeing to, needed to maintain some sense of control even as she surrendered to circumstances beyond her influence. "Somewhere safe," Aureliano said. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd heard that promise before, from other people who'd turned out to be wrong or lying, both. But Caden coughed again, and safety became relative. Sometimes the risk of trusting was smaller than the risk of staying. She got in the car. The palace gates opened with a mechanical hum that made Caden flinch against Mirella's shoulder. 2 guards stepped forward, saw Aureliano's face through the windshield, and stepped back without speaking. Their movements were choreographed, rehearsed. They'd learned not to ask questions about unexpected passengers. The driveway was longer than some of the streets Mirella had lived on. Trees lined both sides, planted at precise intervals and trimmed into shapes that didn't occur in nature. The grass was green even though it was late autumn, probably watered by some automated system that never failed or ran dry. "Jesus," she whispered. Aureliano glanced at her. "What?" "Nothing." She pulled Caden closer, though he'd stopped shivering once the car's heater kicked in. His breathing was still rough, but the wheeze had softened. Warmth helped, even temporary warmth. The car stopped in front of marble steps that led to doors tall enough for giants. More guards appeared, these ones wearing different uniforms. Blue instead of black, with gold trim that caught the light. Their faces held the same trained blankness as the gate guards. "Sir." The nearest guard opened Aureliano's door. "We weren't expecting—" "I know." Aureliano got out, then walked around to Mirella's side. She was already opening her door, unwilling to wait for help or permission. Caden's head lolled against her neck as she shifted him to a better carrying position. The guard's eyes flicked to Mirella, then to Caden, then back to Aureliano. His expression didn't change, but his posture did. Slight straightening, hands moving closer to his sides. Ready for orders he didn't understand yet. "They need medical attention," Aureliano said. "And rooms. Rooms. Plural." Mirella caught that, filed it away as information that might matter later. She'd expected to be processed somehow, documented and assigned to some form of temporary housing. She hadn't expected to be treated as guests. "Of course, sir. Should I contact Dr. Henley?" "Yes, immediately." The guard spoke into a radio clipped to his collar. His words were too quiet to hear, but Mirella caught the tone, urgent but controlled. Palace emergencies were handled differently than street emergencies, with more resources, less panic. They walked up the steps together. Mirella counted them automatically, 15, and noticed that each one was exactly the same height. Someone had measured and calculated and probably tested the optimal rise for people carrying heavy loads or wearing formal clothes. No one had stumbled here in years. The doors opened before they reached them. Another guard, or maybe a servant. Hard to tell the difference when everyone wore uniforms. He stood aside to let them pass. The entrance hall was bigger than most of the apartments Mirella had ever lived in. The ceiling disappeared into shadows that suggested more height than necessary for any practical purpose. Footsteps echoed, not just theirs, but others approaching from different directions. Palace staff mobilizing around an unexpected situation. Each person knowing their role, without being told exactly what was happening. The efficiency was impressive, and slightly terrifying. A woman appeared, elderly and sharp-eyed, wearing clothes that looked expensive but practical. "Your Majesty." She nodded to Aureliano, then looked at Mirella with frank assessment. Not hostile exactly, but thorough. "I'm Mrs. Crawford, the head of household. These are your guests?" "Yes." Aureliano's voice carried a note Mirella hadn't heard before. Authority, but defensive authority. "They'll need the guest wing prepared. And clothes." Mrs. Crawford's gaze lingered on Mirella's layered shirts, the tears and stains that marked each piece as salvaged rather than chosen. "Of course. What sizes?" Mirella started to answer, but Caden chose that moment to wake up fully. He lifted his head from her shoulder and stared at the enormous room around them. His eyes went wide, not with wonder, but with the careful alertness of a child who'd learned that new places could be dangerous. "Where are we?" His voice was small and scratchy. "Safe," Mirella said automatically. Then, because she couldn't keep lying to him forever, "We're visiting someone." Caden studied the faces around them. All adults. All watching him with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. He'd learned to read adult expressions, to distinguish between people who might help and people who might hurt. These people looked like they might do either, depending on circumstances he couldn't control. "Can we leave?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Everyone waited for Mirella to answer, but she found herself looking at Aureliano instead. Could they leave? Or had accepting his help created obligations she didn't understand yet? "Yes," Aureliano said. "You can leave whenever you want." The words sounded true, but words weren't always reliable. Mirella had heard promises before, from people who'd seemed sincere right up until the moment they weren't. Still, Caden relaxed slightly against her shoulder. The option to leave was something he could understand. Dr. Henley arrived then, a middle-aged man with careful hands and the kind of gentle voice people used around sick children. He approached slowly, letting Caden see him coming. "Hello there," he spoke to Caden, not to Mirella or Aureliano. "I'm a doctor. Would it be all right if I listened to your breathing?" Caden looked at Mirella. She nodded, and he nodded too. Dr. Henley knelt down to child height, which put him at eye level with Caden. He moved his stethoscope slowly, letting Caden see and touch it before placing it against his chest. The examination was thorough but unhurried. Dr. Henley checked Caden's temperature, looked in his throat, asked gentle questions about how he felt. His movements were practiced but not rushed. Palace medicine was different from emergency room medicine, apparently. More time, more care, more resources per patient. "Mild bronchitis," he said finally, "and he's dehydrated. Nothing serious, but he'll need rest and fluids. Maybe some antibiotics to prevent complications." Antibiotics. Mirella had tried to get antibiotics for Caden 3 weeks ago, but the clinic in their district had run out. The pharmacist had suggested honey and warm drinks, as if tradition could substitute for actual medicine. Here, antibiotics were mentioned casually, as if they were always available. "I'll prepare everything he needs," Dr. Henley said. "And you, miss, when did you last have a proper meal?" The question caught Mirella off guard. She'd been focused on Caden's health for so long that her own had become secondary. Food was whatever was left after making sure he ate. Sleep was whatever time remained after watching for dangers he was too small to spot himself. "I eat," she said. Dr. Henley's expression suggested he heard the evasion. "I'll have the kitchen prepare something for both of you. Easy on the stomach. Your systems might not be used to rich food." Rich food. As if richness was a medical consideration. something that required gradual introduction rather than immediate consumption. Another difference between palace life and street life. Here, even generosity required careful management. Mrs. Crawford stepped forward. "I'll show you to your rooms. You can rest while we prepare everything you'll need." Rooms again. Mirella followed her through corridors lined with paintings of people who looked important and dead. The carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps completely. Doors appeared at regular intervals, each one leading to spaces Mirella couldn't begin to imagine. They stopped at a door that looked identical to all the others. Mrs. Crawford opened it to reveal a bedroom larger than any place Mirella had ever slept. The bed was big enough for 4 people, covered with blankets that looked like they'd never been used. Sunlight streamed through windows that were actually clean. "There's a connecting door to the child's room," Mrs. Crawford said, pointing to a door Mirella hadn't noticed. "And a bathroom through there." A bathroom. Private, clean, with hot water that probably worked every time you turned it on. Mirella felt something loosen in her chest. Some tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. Caden had found the connecting door and was peering into the adjoining room. "There's toys?" he called out, wonder creeping into his voice despite his attempts to remain cautious. "Palace children sometimes visit," Mrs. Crawford explained. "We keep things for them. Palace children. Kids who lived in places like this, who probably took clean bathrooms and available antibiotics for granted." Caden was exploring cautiously, touching things lightly as if they might disappear or transform into something dangerous. "Food will arrive shortly," Mrs. Crawford said. "And clothes. Is there anything specific you need?" What did she need? The question was too big to answer quickly. She needed Caden to be healthy. She needed to understand what accepting this help would cost them. She needed to know whether the door would lock from the inside, whether there were other ways out of the room besides the main entrance. She paused. "Just time to think." Mrs. Crawford nodded as if this were a reasonable request. "Of course. Ring the bell if you need anything." She pointed to a cord hanging beside the bed. "Someone will come immediately." Someone would come. Not might come. Not eventually come. Would come. As if service were a law of physics rather than a favor that could be withdrawn. After Mrs. Crawford left, Mirella sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was soft but firm, designed for comfort rather than endurance. Caden had found a wooden train set and was examining it with the careful attention he gave to anything new and potentially valuable. Through the window, she could see gardens that extended further than some neighborhoods. Flowers bloomed in patterns too perfect to be natural, tended by people whose job was maintaining beauty for its own sake. Everything was clean and orderly and deliberately pleasant. It felt like a trap, but traps usually looked dangerous. This looked like everything she'd ever wanted for Caden. Safety, comfort, medical care, food that arrived without begging or scavenging. The fact that it felt too good to be true didn't make it false. Sometimes good things happened for no reason. Sometimes they happened for reasons you discovered too late. Caden brought the train to show her. "Look, it has wheels that actually turn. Actual wheels that actually turned." A concept so basic it shouldn't have been remarkable. Except that most of his toys had been broken when he found them. Broken things were what they could afford. What people threw away when they stopped working properly. "It's nice," she said. He studied her face, reading her mood the way he'd learned to read weather and adult expressions and all the other unpredictable forces that shape their days. "Are you scared?" The question was too honest to deflect. "A little." "Of him? The man who brought us here?" "Not exactly." She pulled him onto her lap, felt his solid warmth against her chest. "Sometimes good things cost more than they tell you at first." Caden nodded with the seriousness of a child who'd learned not to trust easy answers. They sat together on the too-soft bed, surrounded by luxury they didn't understand, waiting for whatever came next. Outside, rain began to fall against windows that someone else would clean. The morning brought noise Mirella didn't recognize. Footsteps in hallways, doors opening and closing with mechanical precision. The distant hum of machines she couldn't identify. Palace sounds. The rhythm of a place where many people worked to maintain comfort for a few. Caden had slept through the night without coughing. The antibiotics were working. Or maybe just being warm and dry had been enough. He lay beside her now, breathing quietly into the pillow. His face looked different without the tight lines of discomfort around his eyes. Someone knocked. Not the sharp rap of authority, but the gentle tap of service requesting permission. "Come in!" Morella called, sitting up and smoothing her hair. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes. The clean pajamas Mrs. Crawford had provided lay folded on a chair, untouched. Sleeping in borrowed clothes felt too much like accepting permanent residency. A young woman entered carrying a tray that smelled like real breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice in a glass pitcher that caught the morning light. The portions were larger than anything Morella and Caden typically ate in a full day. "Good morning, miss. I'm Sarah." The woman set the tray on a small table near the window. "His Majesty asked me to let you know he'll be available this morning, whenever you're ready to speak with him." Speak with him. Not report to him or meet with him, but speak. The distinction felt important. Though Morella couldn't say exactly why, words that sounded casual often carried weight they didn't advertise. "Where is he?" "The morning room, on the second floor." "I can show you when you're ready." Sarah left quietly. The way palace staff had learned to enter and exit without disturbing the atmosphere they served. Caden woke to the smell of bacon, his eyes going wide at the sight of the breakfast spread. "Is this all for us?" "Seems like it." He ate with careful enthusiasm, tasting everything but not gorging himself. Street wisdom. When you didn't know where the next meal was coming from, you ate what was offered but stayed alert for the catch. Even good fortune required vigilance. Morella picked at the toast, her stomach too tight for much food. The orange juice was fresh squeezed, probably from oranges that cost more than she typically spent on a week's worth of meals. Each sip tasted like guilt she couldn't name. After breakfast, she left Caden with the toy train and followed Sarah through corridors that revealed more of the palace's scale. Paintings lined the walls, previous kings and queens, probably. All of them wearing expressions that suggested they'd never doubted their right to live in rooms larger than most people's entire worlds. The morning room faced east, filled with light that showed dust motes drifting in careful patterns. Aureliano sat at a desk covered with papers, wearing clothes that looked expensive but rumpled. He hadn't slept well, apparently. Even kings had nights that fought back. "Morella," he stood when she entered. A gesture of courtesy that felt strange coming from someone whose word could reshape laws. "How is Caden?" "Better. The doctor's medicine helped." "Good." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." She sat, but kept her back straight and her feet flat on the floor, ready to stand quickly if necessary. The chair was comfortable enough to sink into, but comfort could be a trap when you needed to stay alert. "I've been thinking," Aureliano said, settling back into his chair, "about what I saw yesterday, about how many others there might be." Others. The word hung between them, carrying implications Morella understood better than he did. There were always others. People sleeping on garbage, children coughing in makeshift shelters, families choosing between food and medicine because they couldn't afford both. "Lots of others," she said. "I know. That's the problem." He picked up a pen, then put it down without writing anything. "I've been signing reports for years that said everything was improving. Housing initiatives, healthcare expansion, economic development, all of it looked successful on paper. On paper. Where statistics lived instead of people, where percentages replaced faces, and improvement could be measured without being seen." Morella had never appeared on paper, had never been counted in the calculations that determined success or failure. "Maybe the papers were wrong," she said. "Maybe I was wrong not to look past them." The admission surprised her. Powerful people usually defended their decisions, explained why circumstances had forced their choices. They didn't often acknowledge that they'd simply failed to pay attention. "So what now?" she asked. "I don't know." The honesty in his voice was more unsettling than any lie would have been. "I can help you and Caden. I can make sure you have housing, medical care, education for him. But that doesn't address the system that put you on the street in the first place." System. As if her situation had been created by some impersonal machinery, rather than by specific choices made by specific people. But systems were easier to blame than decisions, and decisions were easier to change than the beliefs that guided them. "You could change things," she said. "Could I?" He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. "I thought I had been changing things. Every budget I approved, every program I funded, every reform I signed, it all looked like progress. But progress toward what? Toward you sleeping on garbage while I counted successful initiatives." The question was rhetorical, but Morella answered anyway. "Progress toward making the numbers look better." He winced. "Yes, Exactly that. A long silence settled between them. Outside the window, gardeners worked on flower beds that would bloom in perfect patterns, tended by people whose wages were probably more than most families in the Eastern District saw in a month. Beauty maintained by invisible labor, perfection that required constant management. "What do you want from us?" Morella asked. "Nothing." The answer came quickly, defensively. "You don't owe me anything for helping you. Everyone wants something. I want to know how to fix this, how to change things so that what happened to you doesn't happen to others." Fix. Change. The words carried weight they couldn't support. Morella had heard them before, from social workers and politicians and charity volunteers who'd meant well, but understood little. Fixing required understanding causes, and causes were complicated. Changing required admitting that the current system worked exactly as designed, just not for everyone. "You can't," she said. "Can't what?" "Fix it." "Not really." She looked around the morning room, taking in the expensive furniture and careful decoration. "This place exists because places like where you found me exist. Someone has to sleep on garbage so someone else can sleep on silk." Aureliano's face went pale. I don't believe that. Doesn't matter what you believe. Look at your budget. Look where the money goes and where it doesn't. Look at who makes decisions and who lives with the results. The truth sat between them like something heavy and unwelcome. Morella could see him processing it, trying to find exceptions or alternatives that would let him keep believing in solutions that didn't require fundamental changes. "So what do I do?" he asked. "Whatever you want. You're the king." "That's not helpful." "It's honest." He picked up the pen again, this time starting to write something. His handwriting was neat, controlled, the script of someone who'd learned that words on paper carried legal weight. But he stopped after a few lines, staring at what he'd written as if the words had surprised him. "I'm ordering a full investigation of the Eastern District," he said. "Complete assessment of living conditions, resource distribution, administrative oversight, everything." Morella nodded. "That sounds official." "It is official. It has to be, or it won't happen. And after the investigation, I'll have information, data, evidence of what needs to be changed. And then?" He didn't answer immediately. The question required admitting that information by itself changed nothing. That data was only useful if people with power were willing to act on it in ways that might cost them something. "Then I'll decide what to do with what I learn," he said finally. Decide. Another word that carried more weight than it could support. As if decision-making were simply a matter of choosing between clear options, rather than navigating competing interests and limited resources, political realities that resisted change. "What about us?" Morella asked. "While you're investigating and deciding. You stay here, for as long as you want. Caden gets the medical care he needs, education, whatever he requires to be healthy and safe. Safe." The word sounded like a promise he couldn't guarantee. Safety for her and Caden might require choices that made others less safe. Resources were finite. Even for kings, every room in the palace was a room that couldn't be built elsewhere. "And if we want to leave, then you leave. But," he hesitated, "where would you go?" "Back to the streets, probably. Back to sleeping on garbage and scavenging for food and watching Caden cough through nights when medicine wasn't available. Back to being invisible to systems that worked fine for people who never had to test their limits." "I don't know," she said. "Then stay. At least until I figure out how to do better." How to do better. As if better were a technique that could be learned rather than a commitment that required giving up things he valued. As if the system that had produced the palace and the garbage dump could be reformed without acknowledging the connection between them. But Caden was healthy here. He slept without coughing, ate without worry, played with toys that worked properly. Those facts mattered more than the philosophical problems with accepting help that didn't address underlying causes. "We'll stay for now," she said. "Good." Relief flooded his voice. "I'll make sure you have everything you need. Everything they needed. Except the certainty that staying was truly safe. Or that leaving would be possible if the cost of help became too high. Except the knowledge that other children were still coughing in the Eastern District, while Caden played with working toys in heated rooms. Morella stood to leave. "The investigation you're ordering. How long will it take?" "I don't know. Months, probably. Maybe longer." Months of staying in palace luxury while documenting the misery that luxury was built on. Months of Caden growing accustomed to comfort he might not be able to keep. Months of Aureliano learning things that might make him feel better about his ignorance without requiring him to change anything fundamental. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. "I hope I do too." She left him writing at his desk, crafting official language that would launch the investigation into problems he'd been signing documents about for years. The words would be precise and authoritative, designed to produce results that could be measured and reported. Whether they would produce change was a different question. Back in her room, Caden was building something elaborate with wooden blocks. A castle, maybe, or a fort. Something with walls thick enough to keep dangers outside. He looked up when she entered, reading her expression with the careful attention he'd learned to pay to adult moods. "Are we staying?" he asked. "For now." "Good." He returned to his construction, adding another wall to whatever he was building. "I like it here." Of course he liked it here. Warm, safe, well-fed, surrounded by toys that worked, and adults who spoke gently. He was 3 years old. He didn't understand the cost of accepting help, or the uncertainty of staying in places that could withdraw their welcome without warning. Marella sat on the bed and watched him build. Outside the window, rain began to fall on gardens that would continue blooming regardless of weather, maintained by systems designed to produce beauty for those who could afford it. The rain would also fall on the Eastern District, on people still sleeping on garbage, still choosing between food and medicine. The investigation would document their existence. Officials would count them, categorize them, recommend solutions that might or might not be implemented. Some might be helped, temporarily. Others would remain invisible until someone else happened to walk through the right place at the right time. Caden finished his castle and stood back to admire it. "Look," he said. "It has walls to keep the bad things out. Walls. A solution that worked by exclusion, by keeping some things inside and others outside. Simple, effective, and completely dependent on staying on the right side of the barrier." "It's very nice," Marella said. He knocked it down and started building something else. 8 months later, the investigation report sat on Aureliano's desk in a binder thick enough to stop a door. 437 pages of documentation, statistics, photographs, and recommendations. The Eastern District had been mapped, measured, and categorized with the thoroughness that bureaucracy brought to problems it wanted to appear serious about solving. Marella had read parts of it. The language was careful, clinical. Substandard housing conditions, inadequate infrastructure maintenance, resource allocation disparities. Words that made poverty sound like a technical malfunction rather than the predictable result of deliberate choices. The report recommended increased funding, improved oversight, expanded services. All reasonable suggestions that would require budget reallocations and political negotiations, the kind of sustained attention that competed with other priorities. Implementation was scheduled to begin pending legislative approval and resource availability. Pending, the most honest word in the document. Caden had grown 3 inches and learned to read. Palace tutors were thorough, patient, equipped with materials that made education feel like play instead of work. He could sound out words in books that cost more than most families spent on clothing. His cough had disappeared completely. He also asked questions that Marella couldn't answer. Why didn't other kids live in places like this? Why had they lived on garbage when there were so many empty rooms? Why couldn't everyone have doctors who came when you called for them? Questions that cut through the careful language adults used to avoid acknowledging contradictions they couldn't resolve. The legislative session starts next month, Aureliano had told her last week. The housing initiative will be introduced then. Housing initiative. Another set of words designed to sound substantial while promising nothing specific. Initiatives could be discussed, amended, postponed, or quietly abandoned without anyone having to admit failure. "How many people are still sleeping outside?" Marella had asked. He hadn't known. The investigation had counted structures and documented conditions, but hadn't maintained ongoing census data. People moved, died, found temporary shelter, lost temporary shelter. Numbers changed faster than reports could track them. Today was Wednesday. Marella knew because palace life ran on schedules that marked time in ways she'd never experienced before. Meals arrived at predictable hours. Caden's lessons followed set patterns. Staff meetings occurred according to calendars that stretched months into the future. Wednesday also meant the Eastern District aid distribution, run by volunteers who brought food and supplies to people who couldn't reach centralized services. Marella had asked to go. Not to help, she wasn't qualified to organize anything, but to see. Mrs. Crawford had arranged everything with the efficiency she brought to palace operations. Transportation, schedules, security protocols, systems designed to ensure that even charity happened in orderly, manageable ways. The drive to the Eastern District took longer than Mirella remembered. Construction had begun on new roads, part of the infrastructure improvements recommended by the investigation. Orange cones and machinery marked progress that would eventually connect the district to the rest of the kingdom through properly paved routes, but the construction had made existing roads impassable. People walked longer distances to reach transportation, carried supplies through detours that added hours to simple tasks. Progress created its own obstacles. The aid distribution site was in a parking lot behind a building that might have been a school, or community center, before budget cuts closed it down. Tables loaded with canned goods and used clothing, volunteers checking names against lists, recipients waiting in lines that formed without anyone directing their organization. Mirella recognized faces in the crowd. Not individuals. She'd never stayed long enough in any one place to build relationships, but types. The careful alertness of people who'd learned to be grateful for help, while expecting it to come with conditions. The practiced patience of those who knew that complaining about wait times or limited choices could disqualify you from receiving anything at all. A woman stood near the clothing table, holding a child about Caden's age. The child was thin, but not starving, dressed in layers that looked warm enough for now, but wouldn't last through winter. The woman examined each piece of donated clothing carefully, feeling fabric and checking seams with hands that knew the difference between things that would last and things that would fall apart after one washing. "Mama, can we get the red coat?" the child asked. The woman looked at the coat, then at other options available. The red coat was smaller but newer, brighter but impractical. She picked up a brown jacket instead, testing its weight and checking the zipper. "This one will keep you warmer," she said. The child accepted the explanation without argument. He'd learned not to want things for reasons like color or appearance. Warmth mattered. Style didn't. Mirella watched the exchange and thought about Caden's closet, filled with clothes chosen for fit and preference rather than durability. He owned more shoes than this child would see in a year, picked outfits based on comfort and whim because practicality was guaranteed. A volunteer approached the woman with a form to fill out: name, address, family size, specific needs, information that would be compiled into databases designed to track resource distribution, prevent fraud. The woman answered questions slowly, spelling words she rarely had reason to write, providing details about circumstances that changed too often for forms to capture accurately. "Thank you," she said, when the volunteer finished recording her information. "Of course." The volunteer's smile was genuine but tired. "We're here every Wednesday if you need anything else." Every Wednesday. Weather permitting, volunteers willing, supplies available. Charity that depended on continued goodwill rather than guaranteed systems. Help that could disappear if priorities changed or donations decreased, or political attention moved to other problems. The woman and her child left with a bag of food and the brown jacket. They walked toward the construction zone, where temporary barriers forced them to follow a longer route home, progress that made immediate life harder, while promising eventual improvement. Mirella stayed until the last recipient left, and volunteers began folding tables. The efficiency was impressive. Organized distribution, minimal waste, careful documentation of everything given away. But the line of people needing help had been longer than the supplies available. Some had gone home empty-handed, told to return next week when new donations might have arrived. Next week, another set of words that promised nothing while suggesting possibility. The drive back to the palace took them past construction sites and planned development areas, through districts where improvement was visible in fresh paint and repaired infrastructure. Progress was happening, measurable and documented. The investigation had produced results. Just not enough results. Not fast enough. Not for everyone who needed them. At the palace, Caden was waiting with a book he'd learned to read by himself. A story about a dragon who shared his treasure with villagers, teaching lessons about generosity and community cooperation. The kind of simple moral narrative that made complex problems seem solvable through individual virtue and good intentions. "Did you help people today?" he asked. Mirella sat beside him on the bed that was still too soft, but no longer felt foreign. "I watched other people help. That's good too, right?" She pulled him against her side. breathing in the scent of expensive shampoo and clean clothes, and the security that came from never having to worry about where the next meal would come from. "Yes," she said. "That's good too." Outside the window, evening light caught the gardens where flowers bloomed in patterns maintained by workers whose names she didn't know, whose wages came from budgets she'd never seen, beauty sustained by systems that remained largely invisible to those who benefited from them. The investigation report would move through legislative processes, generating discussions and amendments, compromise solutions. Some recommendations would be implemented, others would be modified or delayed, quietly abandoned. Progress would continue, measured in increments that looked substantial on paper and felt inadequate to people still sleeping on garbage. Caden turned the page of his book. The dragon was learning to share, discovering that giving away treasure made him happier than hoarding it. Simple lessons for complex problems, stories that ended with everyone satisfied and wisdom gained. Morella read along, following words her son had learned to sound out in rooms heated to perfect temperatures. Surrounded by books he could choose based on interest rather than availability. She didn't point out the contradictions between the dragon's world and the one they'd left behind. Some stories were meant to teach hope rather than accuracy. Tomorrow was Thursday. Caden's lessons would continue. Aureliano would sign more documents, approve more initiatives, work to improve systems that functioned exactly as they'd been designed to function. Volunteers would prepare for next Wednesday's distribution, counting supplies and organizing routes through construction zones that marked progress toward better infrastructure. And in the Eastern District, people would sleep where they could find space, eat what they could find or afford, wake up to days that looked much the same as the days before, waiting for changes that might come. Eventually, if resources allowed and priorities aligned and political will sustained itself long enough to matter. The dragon finished sharing his treasure. Everyone in the village lived happily ever after. Caden closed the book with satisfaction. Another story completed with all its problems resolved. "Can we read another one?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Morella said. "It's time to sleep now." He settled against her shoulder. Safe and warm, and surrounded by comfort he'd learned to take for granted. Outside, rain began to fall on gardens that would continue blooming, and districts that would continue flooding. On palace walls that kept good things in, and garbage dumps that kept unwanted things contained. The rain made soft sounds against windows that someone else would clean. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.